Hello students, this is Professor McDonald, and this will be another narrated PowerPoint presentation. Next slide. This particular chapter, we're going to look at domestic terrorism in the United States. In fact, as we discuss it, you'll see that we're going to go back 30 or 40 years and look at a history and pattern, and then also look at some of the current threats. But primarily, it's more of a historical journey in the modern times, looking at terrorism within the United States. When we're talking about domestic, we're talking about within our own borders. Next slide. This is a chart or a table that appears in our textbook, page 183, and it's a terrorism in the United States by group class, and what this means is this is between 1980 and 2001, and it includes terrorist incidents, suspected terrorist incidents, etc. And it just kind of gives you a breakdown. And if you look at this particular, we've engaged, which is unique to the United States as compared to other parts of the world. We've got left-wing terrorist activity, we have right-wing, we have international or terrorism that's spilled over borders. You have your special interest, your individual or your lone wolf incidents. What's interesting about the United States is, and as we discuss this in the textbook, many of our extremism and terrorism does seem to fit into that ideological continuum that we talked about before, with your left-wing extremism and terrorism and your right-wing extremism and terrorism. It does appear that political violence in this country does fall within those categories. And the numbers you see here absolutely represent the number of incidents. Next slide. This is an informative table within the textbook. This is on page 182, and it just gives you a, in the United States, terrorism has typically been conducted by groups and individuals espousing or claiming leftist or rightist ideologies, or those who engage in international spillover conflicts. These interests are motivated by different ideologies, operate at different times, they have different targets, different profiles, etc. Let's look at one of these so we can understand how to read this particular chart. We're talking about an activity profile. Let's start at the top left. The environment, leftist or left wing. Ideological profile, Marxist, which would be an attraction to socialism and communism and the teaching of Marx. Remember when we talked about that before, the equal distribution of wealth, in particular the rise of the proletarian class, which is being usurped and exploited by the ruling class. I'm not going to go through that whole lecture again, but that's your Marxist, your Soviet Union, your left-wing, your Cubists, and also left-wing nationalism, where you'll see something, and we'll talk about that as we get into it. Where are the bases of operation? And of course, nationalism, just to back up, is would be like a revolutionary nationalist movement espousing the needs and the ideology of that particular group. Bases of operation, your urban areas, your suburbs. We'll see that when we talk about the rise of black power and some of the organizations that espoused or emerged from that movement. Organizational profile would be clandestine, secret groups based on movements. Their typical targets, in other words, if they engage in violence, it would be symbolic structures. A symbolic structure could be a government building, it could be a post office, it could be an ROTC building if their particular beef is with the military. And avoidance of human targets, but that's not always the case, because as we get into the left-wing environment, what you're going to find is many times they did target individuals. But you don't see the type of violence that we see today with the new terrorism, with the maximization of casualties, the suicide bombers. These activities were not anything like that during that time period. On the right-wing side, the next line, the rightist, we're looking at our racial supremacists, our anti-government religious people. Many of these are based in rural areas, small towns. Their profile, self-isolated groups, cells, lone wolves, and symbolic structures, again targeting Could be something like a Jewish synagogue, say, for example, or in individuals that are in that Jewish synagogue, or it could be human targets. It could be racial-based, etc. It could be abortion providers. All right, so that's kind of how you read that, and you can read the rest of that chart yourself. And when they talk about the old international terrorism, they're talking about the old anti-Castro groups, the IRA supporters. Of course, in today, our new international terrorism, the ideological profile is predominated by religion. Next slide. This slide is titled Leftist Activism and Ideological Extremism. And obviously, you recognize the pictures of those individuals. The one at the top is, of course, Martin Luther King. And who is the person below him? I want you to figure that out. What you see here is the origins of the Civil Rights Movement, the movement for equality for African Americans in the South. Martin Luther King, his theory, his movement was based on collective nonviolence. And what does that mean? Well, that means massive resistance, moral suasion, trying to make your argument based on the morality of your movement, peaceful behavior, and when these things work together, they're powerful and they can cause change, political change. And of course, at this point in the Civil Rights Movement, what King and his followers were looking for was equality for African Americans in the South. And as it turned out, it wasn't just the South, it was throughout the country, even though a lot of the focus is on the southern states. And of course, whenever you have political change, there's always going to be resistance. And we know what that's like. We don't like to change our daily habits and our behaviors. We resist these things. Well, as you can imagine, there are people within society and within the political environment who are resistant to these activist ideas. A lot of it, if you look back to the 1950s, you see movements by King and the NAACP to end, first of all, like to end segregation on things such as trains and interstate buses. They talk in the textbook about a 13-month bus boycott in the city of Birmingham, Alabama, from I think it was 65 to 66, when blacks boycotted a particular bus line simply because it wasn't because of the segregation nature of how that bus line operated. Up to that point, the federal government had ruled that transportation had to be, interstate transportation had to be fully integrated, but that had not, those decisions didn't actually impact many of the intrastate. And so the movement had to address those issues as well. And eventually the Supreme Court ruled and forced compliance with the bus company in Birmingham. And of course you're going to get that resistance, like I talked about, to change. And that could be violence such as bombings. Many of us have heard about the Birmingham bombing of the church there. You might have violence against individuals, activists that were going into the South in support of the movement, and as the movement moved forward, there were those within the movement that disagreed with the concept or the strategy, I'll say, of collective nonviolence. In other words, they felt resistance needed to be much more stronger, and change was not coming quick enough. So what you see is the emergence of movements within the movement that take it further, and eventually that evolution would result in organizations that would splinter off, that would be more prone to engage in violence to obtain change. One of these individuals was Stokely Carmichael. He formed a group called the Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and this group ultimately is credited with the term the rise of black power. So what do you see is again the reaction, and what are these groups looking for? They're looking for political independence, economic self-sufficiency, and cultural reawakening within, say, the black community. Now, this was not just occurring in rural areas, this was in urban areas as well. And from this concept of black power, you will see groups such as the Black Panther Party, or as they're called, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And they were organized in Oakland, California, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit more in the next slide. So anyway, what we're seeing here is the origins of the civil rights movement, the rise of black power, and the reasons for it. Next slide. The Black Panther Party, again, was when it was formed in Oakland by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. There's a picture of those two individuals there in front of you. It's called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. They had been influenced by Malcolm X. They favored black nationalism. Many of them, and the group itself, believed, and when you look at the Panther Party and their eventual chapters, this is really an urban-based group. The problems in urban movement in cities like Oakland, problems with the relationship between the police, who were mostly white, in these inner cities, and so what you see is conflict. You see these groups organized to counter what they felt was, they even, at times they were described, the police, as an occupation force within the black communities. I've included some elements here of the Black Panther Party platform. This is not in your textbook, something I wanted to provide to you. And if you look through it, I'll let you look through it on things such as decent housing and sound education. These are logical things that you would think any movement would want as it tries to raise the political power and economic self-sufficiency of its representative group. But there also are things here such as exemption from military service, their own jurisdiction with the U.S., etc. Obviously, these type of demands, as contained in the platform, would be very, very difficult to achieve here in the United States. And the Black Panthers, they also engaged in community activities to support their community, but where they ran into problems is when they would show up at vehicle stops where the police were. They would be heavily armed, and eventually many of them were arrested. They were involved in shootouts. The Black Panthers had internal and external disputes among the leadership, and eventually the Black Panther Party disintegrated as an influential organization within the country. And of course, but there were other groups that would emerge from that. Next slide. Let's look at leftist activism and ideological extremism. Growth of the new left, again the left side of our political spectrum, arose in the mid-1960s. One of the groups, and I remember this group when I was in college because we had a small chapter of it at my undergraduate school, the University of Georgia. They weren't very influential there, but they were founded at the University of Michigan. They issued a famous edict called the Port Huron Statement. They believed in direct action, confrontation. Arose in the mid-1960s during the Cultural Revolution here in the United States. They were, like the counterculture. You've heard about drugs and the hippies and the alternative lifestyles and the love generation. Their target was what they called the establishment or the military-industrial complex, much of what drove them was the Vietnam War and the escalation of the United States involvement in the Vietnam War. Many of the members of the SDS, they looked at the Cuban Revolution as inspirational, people like Che Guevara, etc. Again, very anti-establishment, but these were not violent people. They did engage in things such as their direct action would be taking over university administration buildings, which they did. But eventually what would happen is there would be individuals from this group that would splinter off and form other groups who would be violent groups like the Weathermen Underground. This was a very, and they called themselves the rise of a student proletariat, and the proletariat, of course, being the type of verbiage that you would find when you're talking about Marxism. Next slide. This is just a slide. I'm not going to go through too much of it, but it just goes to show you the unrest that existed in the United States. Between these, I termed it the long hot summers. I remember this very well. I was at the end of my high school years, getting ready to go start college, and there was a lot of disturbances in the United States, a lot of unrest, especially in the urban cities. And as you can see by the statistics, there were people that were killed, arrest convictions, etc., and millions of dollars worth of damage. Next slide. When we talk about left-wing terrorism, we've been talking about some of the groups that were relatively extremist in some of their ideas, like the New Black Panther Party. Not all their ideas, but some of their ideas. You also saw the emergence, the evolution into new left terrorism, or generation, what they call in the textbook, generational rebellion. It emerged from the Vietnam era and the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s. Wealth should be redistributed to the oppressed, and who's making the case? The group I just talked about, the Students for a Democratic Society, and from the SDS emerged a group called the Weathermen, and I've got a separate slide for them. The Weathermen organization, also known as the Weathermen Underground, and these were violent organizations. Another group was the Symbionese Liberation Army, who actually was also a civil rights-based group, a violent group. They were led by an individual by the name of Donald DeFreeze, who took on another name. He was actually the leader of the group, but he was the only black person or African American in the group itself. And they took credit for assassinating, I'll show you a picture of Dr. Marcus Foster. Very strange assassination, because he was the first black superintendent in the Oakland schools, and it was something over the school district was going to require the students that were going to school there to have ID cards. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong if you know more about this than me, but I think Foster initially was against that idea, but eventually that was something that was going to happen. Well, they assassinated him, and that was a very, very unpopular target within the movement. The two individuals on the bottom, Russell Little and Joseph Romero, were the killers, and they were arrested, murdered, and convicted for that crime. You also see the rise of some of the few violent nationalist movements we have in this country. One of them was the Black Liberation Army. Their attacks were primarily in New York and California. They engaged in bombings, ambushes of police. They robbed banks to support. These were very violent people and criminals. They emerged from former members of the Black Panthers. They had Vietnam veteran members as well. Another case was the Puerto Rican FALN, which was a terrorist group. They wanted complete independence for Puerto Rico. Also, very prolific terrorist group that engaged in many bombings during this time period. Very active in the 80s, late 70s and 80s. Next slide. Here's a quick slide on the Weathermen Underground. Members of this group emerged from the Students from the Democratic Society, engaged in 40 bombings, very violent terrorist group, the Pentagon, the Capitol building, police stations, ROTC buildings. There's two of the more infamous members of that group, Bill Ayers and Bernadette Dorn. None of them were ever prosecuted and went to jail. Ayers is, I think, is a professor at the University of Chicago. He's a controversial figure that you'll occasionally see on TV. Of course, he denies any involvement in any violence. One of the things that kind of put them out of business is some of their members were working in an apartment constructing bombs, and one of the bombs exploded and killed them. Many of the reasons they weren't prosecuted, members of this group, was because the FBI had engaged in wiretapping that was ultimately determined to be unconstitutional, so that really hindered any of the prosecutions of these people. And eventually they evolved from a below secretive, covert organization to go above ground to become activists, nonviolent activists. Next slide. Just a picture of the Symbionese Liberation Army. I talked about the Freeze a minute ago. Very, very violent group engaged in bank robberies. One of their most infamous crimes was they kidnapped the Patty Hearst, who was an heiress to the Hearst Corporation, which was a company that owned major newspapers, etc., throughout the United States. And those pictures there are pictures of Hearst actually engaged in a bank robbery in San Francisco. And of course, she tried to use the Stockholm Syndrome when eventually she was picked up and she was eventually arrested, and it didn't work. She ended up being convicted of that bank robbery, and even though she might have started off as a captive, she seemed to willingly join the group once she got involved. It was very controversial. I believe she went to jail for several years. I'm really not sure whatever happened to her, to be honest with you. Most of the members of the SLA were killed in a major shootout with the police in Los Angeles back during that time period. But still, the revolution continued. Members of the Black Liberation, or some members, former members of the Weathermen and Black Liberation Army, formed a group called the May 19th Communist Organization. But by 1985, they had all been arrested and convicted and sent to prison. So that kind of ended the this real revolutionary emergence of these revolutionary, violent terrorist groups, domestic groups in the United States. Next slide. We also have terrorist groups called single-issue violence, groups who focus on one issue. Animal Liberation Front, they're known for going into government research facilities and releasing animals, causing, burning buildings down, causing a lot of damage. They're not so much a group that targets individuals, but they cause extreme damage. The Earth Liberation Front, the same thing. I remember when I was working in Oregon and I was the manager of our office out there, Earth Liberation Front was active. Was very active in the Pacific Northwest. They were burning down forest ranger buildings. They had some of the wood companies were cutting some of the forest out there, and so what they would do is they would drive spikes into some of those trees. So if a woodcutter's out there and they were using these huge chainsaws, they hit those spikes. Those individuals would be severely injured, as many times those, as you can imagine, those chainsaws could just basically blow up in your hand if you hit some piece of metal as you're trying to cut a tree. But they've also been known, Earth Liberation Front, for going in where there used to be perhaps a parkland or a tree land or woodlands, and where people buy the land, they go in, they cut the trees down, and they build an apartment complex. They're known for burning those down as well. The FBI has done a tremendous job in arresting and pushing these people very, very underground in the last 10 years. And they're still a threat, but they're no longer the threat that they once were. And I remember once I was working a drug case on a target in Eugene, Oregon, members of my team, and we went in, we did a search, and the FBI came to me before the search, and they thought this guy possibly was linked to the Earth Liberation Front and to an organization that possibly had been engaged in an arson, I believe, where a ranger had been severely injured, a forest ranger. And so we met with them. They came in on the search with us. We didn't find any evidence, but it was, again, this was a guy who was a drug target, but he also was a target there. I remember some of these anti-government groups when I was in Oregon. They were very prevalent. You had to watch one of those groups because of the search that I did here, and I had the affidavit was filed, it's a public record affidavit. They issued an arrest warrant for me, some anti-government group, but they would issue their own driver's license and things of that. Very interesting. But they were dangerous, but they were more, again, more environmentally focused. Next slide. You also have your rightist activism, religious politics, and the Christian right, mostly Protestant fundamentalists, not all violent. They link their strict Christian values to political agendas, promote the evangelical agenda, and some of them do engage in violence. You also saw the rise of the anti-government patriots, late 80s into the 90s. They consider themselves to be the true heirs of the ideals or framers of the Constitution. They distrust government. Many believe in the New World Order conspiracy theory. New World Order meaning that things such as the United Nations will eventually take over the United States, and perhaps they're even running the country now. And we've lost our focus. We've lost our connection to the Constitution, and so they believe that they need to be prepared to resist this, quote, New World Order. The same thing happened during the Cold War with communist invaders, but again, hostile with the New World Order, hostile on American interest, UN, Jewish bankers, Council on Foreign Relations, etc., etc. They talk. There's a good box that on pages 193 and 194 that you should review, where they kind of go into some of the more detail relative to the patriot groups, the militia groups here in the United States. And at times, at its peak, there were many members. Many of the militia members became survivalists, talking about going, quote, off the grid by refusing to have credit cards, driver's licenses, Social Security numbers, pay taxes, things of this nature. And we do have another slide that I'll talk about this a little bit more. But you do see on the right, this is the right side. This considered to be right fringe, your extremist and your terrorist groups. But when you talk about the militia groups, some of them have crossed into terrorism, but many of them are extremist groups. And again, they see their life being, they see their lifestyle, they see their power being threatened. Next slide. And of course, with right wing, you see the development of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Focus on racial supremacy, violent assertion of racial doctrine, protect their Protestant Christian identity. As it says in the slide here, a ritualistic fraternity like religious symbolism. And that religious symbolism would be like the burning of crosses, the wearing of the robes. I'm not going to go into all the eras, but it's interesting reading if you read about the various eras of the Ku Klux Klan and how they've evolved. They were founded in 1866 after the Civil War, originally founded as a fraternal organization. The first imperial wizard was a Confederate general, actually a very famous Confederate general named Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was considered one of the the best tacticians on the southern side during the war. He had a lot of successes with his Confederate troops. But he was a former general, and eventually they did engage in violence, targeting blacks, targeting northerners, carpetbaggers, etc. after the Civil War. But they were disbanded, and then what you'll see is from this, you would see other eras arise. Like after the Reconstruction era, they had the second era, the third era, the fourth era, the fifth era of the Klan. So you could read through that, and you'll get an idea of the membership totals, etc. during those time periods. Again, if you look on page 199 at the bottom, there's a table 9.3. You'll get an idea of the mysticism involved with groups like the Klan, with their titles: the National Leaders, the Imperial Wizard, the Ground Dragon, the Exalted Cyclops, etc. You also see the emergence of neo-Nazi terrorism, which is like the American version of Nazism. Again, a racial supremacy, which fits into our right-wing continuum, political continuum. Groups like the Aryan Nation, National Alliance, the White Aryan Resistance. Many of them were influenced by a book called The Turner Diaries, which I've actually ordered a copy, and it's at Pembroke if you're ever interested in reading it. But it talks about an impending race war here in the United States, and it was kind of like an influential textbook that was written that influenced many of these right-wing neo-Nazi groups. Again, for the Klan, many of them, they believe, and the right-wing neo-Nazis, that it's inevitable, a racial holy war. And most of these are smaller groups and lone wolves, the ones that engage in terrorist activity. Next slide. It's just a slide. Another one of the famous terms is the 14 words, racial supremacy on the right, attributed to this gentleman, David Lane, who was a member of a right-wing group called the Order. And of course, the 14 words are: we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. So these again, who are the targets with these right-wing groups? Zionist occupation, the government. They engage in counterfeiting, bank robbery, murder, in particular groups like the Order, etc., to maintain their viability. They need money to obviously operate. The Order itself was primarily operated in the Pacific Northwest. One of the most infamous killings they performed was they killed Alan Berg, who was a Jewish radio host. They murdered him. Most of them were prosecuted, and the main players were prosecuted and imprisoned back in 1985, which kind of put the Order out of business. This slide is just a breakdown of the Klan. I'll let you read that on your own. Again, what's interesting about the Klan too is they move forward. One of the reasons the Klan was severely impacted because the FBI was able to infiltrate it back in the 60s. When it was at its height, as far 50s and 60s. And so eventually they adopted terms like leaderless resistance, phantom cells, to stop infiltration. So you see this change from more of a hierarchical structure with the Imperial Dragon, etc., to more a cell-like structure, whereas if you knock out one cell, the other cell can still operate. Plus, if you pick up one cell and you infiltrate it, that doesn't mean you're going to have access or be able to infiltrate the other cells. We see that with terrorists today. So it's an interesting evolution of an extremist group. Now the Klan today is not a terrorist group. They're not engaging in terrorist activity, but they still have extremist thoughts and motivations and an extremist ideology. Next slide. Patriot movement, I think I've talked about. Looking back to our founding fathers, we have a right to bear arms. People are sovereign. An armed citizenry can counterbalance an oppressive government. We must face this new world order. Government's not to be trusted. Many of them were agitated by what happened at Waco and Ruby Ridge, which were, we talked about Waco, I believe, earlier in the book, where the government moved on the Branch Davidian compound there, and most of those people were killed in a fire that was not set on purpose, but nonetheless, all those people were killed by FBI when the FBI took over. And Ruby Ridge was another incident that involved the shooting of a more of a right-wing survivalist type guy, Weaver. Also, they're anti-gay, anti-government, anti-Jew, anti-immigrant, these type of stances. Next slide. Again, just kind of a repeat. You have the Patriot threat. There's a picture of Oklahoma City, 1995. This was attack carried out by, you should know who did that by, right? Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who assisted him. He had loose affiliations with the Patriot movement, but this was pretty much his operation. He again was stimulated, in his own words, by what happened at Waco and the oppressive government, how the government was oppressing its people, and the people needed to rise up and react. And this was his statement, was this bombing. You also see moralist terrorism they talk about in our textbook, and you get into anti-abortion, anti-gay violence, Army of God, the Phineas priesthood, which is Aryan in nature. Next slide. We also have our American cults, and there's an interesting discussion in the textbook about or chapter perspective about the suicide of the temple members, the Temple of the Disciples of Christ. Founder was Jim Jones. Cults are self-isolated mystical communities that claim to have definitive answers for society and personal problems. Many have charismatic leaders, Jones himself. He eventually moved his people from California or from the United States to Guyana. And as with some cults, some people want to leave, and I don't believe he liked the idea of leaving. And if you read the textbook, there was a U.S. congressman that went down there to check on some of these folks. And while they were down there, they had about 10 or 12 people that wanted to leave the cult. I think there was about 900 at the time. And they were going to leave with the congressman, but Jones had some of his armed people attack the congressman at the airport, killed him, killed several of the other people. Some of them escaped into the woods. And then when he came back, he induced all of his people to drink Kool-Aid, which was laced with arsenic, and they died. A real tragedy. Think about Aum Shinrikyo, and that was another group that we had talked about previously, which was another cult that had been engaged in the Tokyo sarin gas attack in 1995. Next slide. Army of God, very extreme. There's a picture of Paul Hill. You actually have some films to watch. Don't forget that, on domestic terrorism inside the New Black Panther Party and the Skinheads and the Army of God website. And also a really chilling interview with anti-abortionist Paul Hill, who murdered an abortion doctor, a picture that I have there. He also killed that individual's bodyguard, and so make sure you watch that tape. Next slide.